Welcome and thank you for attending GrowSafe's Accelerating Efficiency Together webinar series. I'm Danielle Starr. I'm the Global Marketing Communications Manager for GrowSafe Systems. Today with us, we have Dr. Monty Kerley and Bryce Schumann. Bryce is the Director of Seed Stock Sales for GrowSafe, and together they're going to be discussing the different measures of feed efficiency. This is the first of 5 sessions that we have in our series. Please continue to register for each webinar so you can join us live. And also, after the webinar, you're going to receive a link in an email so that you can watch the webinar on demand. Each session is going to consist of 20 minutes for presentations, and then at the end, we're going to have 10 minutes to allow you to ask questions. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A icon. Feel free throughout the webinar to ask your questions, and then at the end, we'll go through and try to answer as many questions as possible. As you're asking questions, please submit with your name so that if we're not able to get to your question during our allotted time, we'll follow up with you with an answer from Monty or Bryce. Also, throughout our webinar, we're going to be asking some polling questions. So we invite you to engage so that throughout this webinar, we can also give you immediate response to how the group is feeling with those questions. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Bryce and we're going to get started today.
Thank you very much, Danielle. It is a real honor to be involved in this today and being able to participate. As Danielle said, our topic for today is understanding and comparing feed efficiency measures. And as we get started, I'll go through our agenda here. But I also want to thank the team at GrowSafe. These things don't happen by accident. They take a lot of planning and hard work. So I just want to thank all our team members and our leadership team for making this happen. Today, as we discuss this webinar, we're going to talk about the importance of feed efficiency, how feed efficiency is defined, the science behind residual feed intake, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. So why is feed efficiency important? Well, efficient use of resources is always important to agriculture and in particular to animal agriculture. How would you analyze efficiency in your operation? Well, perhaps you would think of it as being able to run more animals on the same amount of resources, or alternatively, maybe you run the same amount of animals on the same resource, but you get a greater amount of output. That would be increasing efficiency as well. And one of the benefits with selecting and improving feed efficiency is that you lower your environmental footprint and increase the sustainability of your operation. So reducing feed and forage input requirements provides you greater profit opportunities for you and your operation. So how is the importance of feed efficiency in our industry? Well, we know with a growing population, if we look at the estimates for 2050, because of the increasing population size, we see meat demand will increase as much as 73% and dairy demand over 50%. And we know as an industry, we face a lot of pressures. The access to skilled labor, we have limited resources, particularly in times like these, we see volatile prices and volatile input of prices. And, we also have a consumer perception that we deal with around animal welfare, antibiotic use, and environmental impact. As an industry, we have done a great job of selecting and identifying animals that improve growth. And particularly as it relates to post-weaning or average daily gain. And why has the selection been so focused on growth? Well, there's an economic reason for that. If you can improve average daily gain by 10%, you improve your profit opportunity by 18%. When we think about feed efficiency, because most of our resources in a livestock operation, in a cattle operation, are related to feed and forage production. In fact, about 70% of all production costs are related to feed and forage. If we can improve feed efficiency by 10%, we improve the opportunity for profit by 43%. So feed efficiency provides great economic sustainability and opportunity for your operation. Well, what are some of the common measures of feed efficiency? The first one I'll talk about is residual feed intake, or RFI. If you're joining us outside the Americas, you may refer to that as net feed intake, but it's the same trait. It's the difference between an animal's actual and its expected intake for a given body size and level of production. And we'll delve into that deeper as we go along in this webinar. We can also look at residual average daily gain. RADG is the difference between an animal's actual weight gain and its predicted gain based on its dry matter intake, body weight, maintenance, and fat cover. And we also have feed conversion ratio, or feed to gain, which is an efficiency measure of intake to an animal's body weight gain. One thing that all these measures share in common is to calculate them on an individual animal standpoint, we have to gather individual dry matter intake. And I know some of the breed associations use dry matter intake, as well as some of these other measures I've talked about. But before we can calculate any of this, we have to gather individual dry matter intake. Now, I'm going to go through a comparison of these intakes, but Danielle, at this point, why don't we bring up the first poll question and get people to interact with us today. So here's the first question, and it's based around the efficiency traits you are measuring and reporting in your own operation. And so just pick the response that best fits your operation, and then Danielle will tell us when we're ready to share the poll results. So please place your votes now.
We still have a few more people voting, so I'll leave the poll open here for just a few more seconds. All right, we're going to close the poll.
Okay, here is the poll results. 45% of you are using residual feed intake. 52% of you said dry matter intake. 31% feed conversion ratio, and 22% residual average daily gain, with the remainder, 7%, choosing other. Thank you for voting. So as we go along with the three measures that I talked about, residual feed intake, with that trait, we're looking at animals with a similar body size and level of performance. And the animal that eats less than expected is considered more efficient. if we look at residual average daily gain, we're looking at animals with where we're standardized, they're on the same amount of intake, but the animal that expresses more gain and is considered more efficient. With feed conversion ratio, you can have the same ratio with different levels of performance. So you can have an animal that expresses a high average daily gain, but also has increased intake. And it's also possible to have animals that have a lower average daily gain, but also have a lowered intake. And so the ratio is the same. So traditionally, RFI has been GrowSafe's measure of choice, and we'll delve into that as we go along today. But as I said earlier, it's independent of body weight, size, and growth rate. If you select for residual feed intake, it does not affect mature cow size. It's associated with reduced methane emissions and increased sustainability. Benefits of selecting for RFI not only benefit the cow-calf herd, also are beneficial to the feedlot industry. So it covers the whole watershed of the industry, and it does not have adverse effects on other economically viable traits. So I've given the definition of RFI a few times now, but how do we use it? How do we look at it? An animal with a low or negative RFI, as opposed to a high RFI animal, an animal with a positive RFI. Low or negative is considered more efficient. Higher positive is considered more inefficient. It's a moderately heritable trait. And as I said earlier, it's independent of body weight, size, and the differences in this trait cannot be detected by simply looking at the animal. We got to measure their individual intake and compare them to the other animals on trial in terms of output and performance. So as we get ready for this feed efficiency comparison, Danielle, why don't we do the next of the poll questions? Okay, the polling question is up, and which efficiency measure tells you which animal has the lowest feed intake to achieve the same level of growth? So please vote now.
We still have votes coming in, so I'll wait just a couple more seconds before we close the poll. All right, we will end the poll.
Okay, the correct answer is residual feed intake, and 61% of you got that right. And so that's very good. So let's move along to the feed efficiency comparison that we have here. You can see that the animal on the left of the screen and the animal on the right of the screen are of a somewhat similar weight. They had the next line down for average daily gain. They had very similar average daily gains. Their expected feed intake based on their trial group, 21.2 for the animal on the left, and 20.5 for the animal on the right. And part of that difference in expected intake is the slight difference in body weight. But if we look at their actual intakes, The animal on the left ate over 24 pounds. The animal on the right ate 17 and a half. So the animal on the left ate more than 3 pounds more than was expected. The animal on the right ate almost 3 pounds less. So there's 6 pounds difference in the average daily intake on those two animals to achieve the same level of production. And if we looked on a 74-day trial, RFI trials are 70 or 49 days, depending on what technologies that you use. If your feed costs you 15 cents a pound, there's almost a $69 difference in the cost of raising those animals over a 74-day period. So it's very significant. So as I wrap up, what are some of the benefits of genetic selection for RFI? Well, you can reduce feed intake by as much as 12%, reduce methane production by 30%, and reduce manure production by 17%. So there are a lot of benefits with RFI. And as an organization, we'd always advocate that the best way to use these tools is in an EPD. And we'll have a future webinar that talks about our network and some of the EPDs that we have available to our clientele. It's my distinct pleasure at this point to introduce Dr. Monty Kerley to talk about the science behind residual feed intake. Welcome, Monty.
Thanks, Bryce. Can you hear me all right?
You bet.
All right. Well, first, I'd like to welcome everybody to Southern Illinois this morning for the webinar and to where I reside at. I want to springboard off of Bryce's comments on really savings and some of the science behind it and some of the data that we've collected showing the effect of selecting for RFI in terms of progeny. The first thing I want to do is talk, though, about and emphasize the cow herd. A lot of the research that we've done and others have done have focused in the feedlot. It's the easiest thing to measure. Obviously, it's very easy to discern dollars and cents differences in selecting for RFI. But actually, I give credit to Australian researchers. And if you look at a lot of the research that was first done when kind of residual feed intake went through its renaissance, and we began getting interested in it, Richardson and Hurd and others down there, and they focused really that there was more impact in the cow-calf herd than there actually was in the feedlot. And so I kind of want to frame that through some of the research we're going to talk about today. If you think there's a $470 annual production cost, that's on the low side for a lot of people, but I still want to give an example of the potential savings. If we could achieve a 20% savings in those production costs, assuming all that went to feed reduction, that's worth $94 per cow-calf unit per year. If that cow could stay in better shape and could be ready for breeding season with limited resources, if we could get that calf born one cycle earlier, that's 70 pounds weaning weight on that calf. And one of the things I think is important that I've heard some folks have been selecting for this multi-generations now is the potential or better luck at keeping the best heifers in the herd. And every time we lose one of those two-year-olds, because we couldn't get her bred back, I put a value of like $1,200 or on that animal. So efficiency is important to the cow herd, I think. It's the message we like to start with there. Next slide, please, Bryce. So next two slides I want to get into talks about the biology of this. Early work showed where variation in energy expenditure occurred among animals. One animal could be better at it than the other one. What's interesting, if you look at the bottom of this slide, heat increment, protein turnover, tissue metabolism, and then other energy expenditures like ion transport in the cell, it was estimated that almost 3/4 of the energy that cell expends goes into those that area of metabolism. And what we know is there can be great differences in the efficiency of cells between animals and how they go about these processes. Next slide, Bryce. So this is some work that we did early on. We were looking at residual feed intake. We had a set of calves on feed, and we contrasted the top calves in terms of efficient. Those were the negative RFI. And then we looked at the calves that were in the bottom of efficiency, and they were the positive RFI calves. And kind of going on with what Bryce was saying, average daily gain was essentially the same, only differed by 0.2 of a pound between those. But there was a big difference in feed to gain. The positive RFI calves had a 7.8 feed to gain. Negative RFI had a 5.7. There's a 1.4-fold difference between those two groups. In almost every group of calves we've fed, what we've seen is there's about a 20% or 40% difference in intake between the highest consuming, lowest consuming calf, with no difference in performance or growth of those calves. When we looked at the energy metabolism of the cell, and specifically we were interested in oxygen metabolism by the mitochondria, and that's what this RCR, the receptor control ratio, shows, is the positive calves had a 2.5, but the negative calves had a 3.4. The negative RFI calves had a 1.4-fold faster uptake of oxygen than what the positive or inefficient calves did. And we've seen this throughout the work we've done. And we believe a lot of the difference between calves or cows in terms of their efficiency or their residual feed intake has to do with cellular energy metabolism. What's important about this, I think, is this is going to be have the same effect on a calf that's in the feedlot that's being fed a corn-based diet compared to a cow that's out, like in my part of the country, on a fescue clover pasture and consuming forages. So the point of that is the biology is going to go across the feed types that we feed to these animals. Next slide, Bryce. I want to get into some work we've done looking at the effect on progeny. So in this study, we had 5 bulls that we used. We were able to generate at least 10 steer calves from each of those bulls. We knew those bulls separated themselves based on their residual feed intake. So bull A had the most negative RFI. Bull E had the most positive RFI of these 5. We then put their progeny, the steer progeny, on feed. We measured the average residual feed intake for their group of progeny. So A had a minus 0.14, E's calves had a 0.16. We looked at average daily gain. Bull A obviously stamped his calves with a little bit of an advantage in growth, but the rest were pretty similar. Intake, so we measured intake, individual intake of each calf, over 400 pounds of gain. And these calves started on the study 9 weight, somewhere in that neighborhood. And this is a total feed that was consumed over that period of time. If we, in that diet, its cost was approximately $240 a ton. And so then we have the feed cost for each of those groups of calves. And then on the last column, I have an advantage. And if we contrast bull A to bull E, there was $77 difference in the amount of feed that those two groups of calves consumed. And the point of that is I want to make, I have some data later on that I'll show that there's about a 10 to 14% improvement in feed efficiency just in the F1s that come from using a negative RFI bull compared to a positive RFI bull. And that's simply what this data is showing. There was a 27% difference in feed to gain and a 20% lower feed cost for calves from Sire A compared to Sire, that should be Sire B, or Sire E, sorry. Next slide, Bryce. Next slide, Bryce. Can you get that?
Just okay.
Okay, so this slide then shows the effect of selecting for RFI on forage intake and milk production by calf. All right, this is the right one, right?
Yes,
All
I'm
right.
sorry.
So this slide shows the difference in forage intake by cows whenever they were tested for residual feed intake as a heifer. So we had a group of, in this case, this was Hereford cows or Hereford heifers, and we tested them for an RFI when they were weighing around 700-pound body weight. The low RFI group had a minus 4.2 pounds RFI. The high RFI had a 5.1 pounds. So good difference between those two. Initial body weights of those heifers was not, initial body weight of the cows was not different, but when we took those cows and kept them in those heifer RFI groups and measured dry matter intake when they were out in pasture, we had a 12.4 kilogram consumption by the low or Efficienc cows and a 15.6 consumption by the high RFI cows. Calf daily gain was essentially the same between those two groups. And so the low RFI cows consumed around 20% less forage than high RFI cows. And I think one of the important points in the advertisement about selection for residual feed intake, biggest impact I think it has is what it does to hay cost for that herd during the winter. Second biggest impact is what it does to carrying capacity of the forage, or in drought conditions, how those cows can get through when there's limited forage. Next slide. This study showed or looked at the potential residual feed intake tested heifers to influence lactating cow performance. This was a group of Sim Angus cows. We typed them for RFI when they were heifers, and then we measured residual feed intake. And remember, as Bryce explained, residual feed intake was a measure of intake regressed on body weight and average daily gain, not milk production of these cows, just body weight and average daily gain. When we categorized them then based on their heifer residual feed intake class and then measured cow RFI, you can see there really is no difference in the cow RFI, 0.1, minus 0.6, and 0.9. Dry matter intake wasn't different among these cows. They were eating about 3.5, 3.6% of body weight. They were lactating though and had cows by their side, and we looked at milk production on these cows in a weigh-suckle weigh procedure. And as we increased efficiency, these cows dropped about 1 kilogram or 2 pounds of milk within each category. We repeated this in the study with some crossbred dairy cows that were grazing dairy cattle, saw the very same response, that milk production was influenced by the residual feed intake of the cow. More efficient, greater ability to produce more milk. Next slide. We've also been interested in comparing heifer and cow residual feed intake. So what this study did was we looked at heifers, we phenotyped them for RFI. We then took out the low RFI group, which is the first column. We took out the second, or the inefficient heifers, the positive RFI, that's the second column. We kept them together and also measured residual feed intake and some of the feed efficiency parameters when they were cows then. And what you can see is that if we use the cow RFI, it did not estimate or did not predict what they did as heifers. When we use the heifer RFI though, that predicted the performance ability of those animals when they were young. Now, what's the take-home message to this? Take-home message is that we've not seen a lot of research that would say we can take a mature animal, do an RFI test on it, and get anything that's going to tell us what the ability of their progeny is going to be. The good thing about, I think, what we found is that we can take heifer data, and that's going to track very well with what that female's offspring is going to do in the feedlot. Next slide, Bryce. This is a study where we looked at the influence of using either RFI negative bulls or females and the effect on the progeny. In the first column, we took a negative RFI sire, bred that to a positive RFI female. In the second column, we took a positive RFI sire, bred it to a negative RFI female. And then the third column, we took both positive RFI sire and mated that to a positive RFI female. And the reason we were interested in this is what impact can we have on the F1s that we produce as we begin these matings. You can see feed conversion ratio. It was essentially 6.3 when we had a negative influence. It went to 6.9. When we had a positive RFI, that's about a 7 or 8% improvement in feed efficiency. Average daily gain didn't change. Hot carcass weight didn't change. And typically what we see is if we use a negative RFI, genetics will actually see some improvement in yield grade on cattle. And that makes sense when we think about the biology of how this probably works through energy metabolism in the cell. There's less carbon to go to fat deposition because they're not over consuming, if you will. There at the bottom, I think two things to keep in mind. Work that we've done, we've seen a 7 to 14% improvement in F1 feed efficiency from RFI tested sires. I don't know anything else I can do when I take a calf and put it in a feedlot to get that kind of improvement. And we've got people that are working with GrowSafe and their equipment that's done RFI selection over multiple generations, and they're producing cattle with 28% lower feed requirements or 28% lower requirement for energy than what the population average is able to achieve. Next slide. So any questions? Danielle, in interest of time, I skipped question 3, but could we put question 4 up? Because that is to me the one that I'd like to have for people to think about and take with, at least through my section of the presentation.
Yes, the polling question.
Yes.
Okay, let me launch that now. We'll take just a couple seconds here. Everyone can place their vote.
And the reason we ask this question is just more of a take home that I don't think anyone would advocate selection for residual feed intake would be a single trait selection process. But the other thing that I would like to advertise is I don't see how we do selection programs for animals if that's not part of the process or not part of the traits that we use in the arsenal trying to make better animals.
We're going to end the poll and I will share the results.
The 5% are all the university professors that are on the webinar. And we're ready for questions, I guess, right?
Yes, with that, we will start off with questions. Thank you both, Dr. Kerley and Bryce, for your time today. Our first question, if you select for RFI, will you get larger, harder fleshing cows? Monty, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, so one thing I guess I would maybe want to discuss a bit is exactly what someone means by harder fleshing. The way that question is typically been asked of me is, can I go out into a herd and the cows that are fleshier means they're efficient? There probably is a correlation. If you look at when an animal is either stressed because of lack of intake, lack of forage on a cow, maybe in the time of when there's even excess forage, I think there would be a correlation between residual feed intake trait of the animal and the amount of flesh it covers. But the problem is there's so many things that impact that we've not been able to see anything we could correlate between conformation, physical appearance of the animal and its you know, how fleshy it is. The biggest thing I think that may impact that is the cow's ability to produce milk. So if I understand the question correctly, there's nothing that you can go out and identify to say this animal's more efficient. There is nothing though, and also in the research that's been done, there's nothing that says that selecting for this trait is going to have any negative impact. The only trait that I know of that's been measured where they've shown some correlation to RFI status is on postpartum interval. If I remember correctly, I think Cliff Lamb at Florida did that work, and they showed like a 3-day longer postpartum interval in negative compared to positive RFI cows. But there's nothing to my knowledge has been measured that would say RFI is linked to negative consequence and other traits that are important.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take another question. How constant is RFI across the life of an animal? Is there any age which is better for RFI measure?
Bryce, you want me to answer that?
Yeah, go ahead, because you addressed that in your presentation.
Yeah, so all the work that we've done is that animal has to still be growing. Where we've been able to contrast has been a mature cow. We've looked at mature cows that were not lactating, just pregnant. We've looked at mature cows that had a calf on their side and nursing a calf on their side. What we do know is that when we take those, if we phenotype the animal for residual feed intake at that point, it does not match up to the heifer phenotype. We also know that if we take a cow phenotype, that if we added milk production to that, it would help some, but it still doesn't give the same phenotype if that cow was, if she was measured as she was a heifer. We also know that we can take a heifer residual feed intake, and that does a very nice job of describing what that cow's progeny is going to do. So the first question is, I feel fairly confident saying that we have to use a growing animal if we want to take that residual feed intake and then apply that to what the cow's going to be able to do on pasture, what the progeny from that animal is going to do in the feedlot. If you drill down deeper and how mature, how heavy can we allow a calf to get and still do residual feed intake, I think there's been some success using back fat as an example to be able to take different weights and bring them together or weight them closer together. But to me, the sweet spot is going to be after weaning up until, below a year of age. And I think, and Bryce, you might comment to this, but I know there's GrowSafe has some guidelines, BIF has some guidelines, and I would yield to them in terms of specifically age and how you assess contemporary group and some of those factors. But not an adult is how I'd like to answer that question.
I think that's fair, Monty, and I think breed associations and BIF have guidelines for the measurement of RFI and dry matter intake, and typically that's somewhere in that post-weaning interval where you can gather yearling weights. So some of those maybe 430 days to 500 days, depending on the association.
Okay, we're going to take just 2 more questions here. So please, if you still have questions, submit them. We'll be sure to get responses to after the webinar. So question here, is there any research done to measure positive or negative RFI cows in their conception rates or in their calving days?
You touched on that, Monty, a little bit.
Yeah, I've not seen anything that would suggest that conception rate would be affected by residual feed intake just due to genetic selection for that trait. We did some work, I think it was with Gene Felton, Matt, and Jerry Yates at West Virginia. I believe, if I remember correctly, Florida may have done some work. The work that we did with West Virginia in a limited forage situation, the heifers that were being studied, the negative RFI heifers, had better gain, were in better condition. I would extrapolate that to say if you have a drought or limited forage conditions, I would expect there to be a possible advantage in conception rate. by negative RF animals in that kind of venue. The only thing that I know of is a postpartum interval. And I think it was a Florida group that measured this. They had about a 3-day longer interval of pregnancy in negative RFI cattle compared to positive RFI cattle.
Great. And our last question. In the American Angus Association, they have an EPD for RADG and DMI. They do not have an RFI EPD. Is this the best way to select for that, by selecting for a higher RADG EPD and lower DMI EPD?
I guess I'll take a stab at that. You know, probably the best way, if you have the ability to collect the information, would be to become a part of our network, where you can get an RFI EPD calculated. To the extent that you're looking at animals with you know, the same growth rate, those that have lower intake should have a more favorable RFI. It's a little bit of a backdoor to what you're suggesting, but I think it gets you part of the way there. Any thoughts, Monty?
Yeah, the first the first response I would have is, and actually I think I think Angus may be reporting that it escaped my understanding why breed associations do not have a residual feed intake EPD. And my hat's off to GrowSafe for being able to give that information from their cooperators out to people. The biggest problem I have with residual average daily gain is the same thing with feed to gain. And that is, if you select for that, the easiest way to improve that is to keep getting larger frame cattle. Now, if you want larger frame cattle, that's great, but there's a difference between the efficiency of energy metabolism, which is, in my view, that's what residual feed intake is, and the other measures. And what's important about residual feed intake is it's not going to be tied to growth rate or mature size of the animal. So the answer to the question is, you may want to use RADG, dry matter intake, in some of your selection criteria. But if what you want to do is select for animals that are more metabolically efficient, the only way to do that's residual feed intake.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for your questions today. Like I said, everyone who submitted a question, we will get you a response via email. If you have any additional questions after the webinar, please feel free to email us at info@growsafe.com, and we'll be able to get you responses from either Dr. Kerley or Bryce Schumann. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. We have another webinar next week, and that will be discussing the multi-breed efficiency EPDs and the GrowSafe network. That will be hosted by John Janot of Neogen and also Mark Nelson from GrowSafe. So please continue to sign up for the webinar. We'd love for you to join us live, or you can watch the webinar on demand later if that doesn't work with your schedule. So thank you for joining us today, and we will see you next week.